The phenomenon, colloquially known as the man-child, and clinically conceptualized through the lens of Dan Kiley's Peter Pan syndrome and Carl Jung's archetype of the Puer Aeternus or eternal boy, represents a complex, multifaceted psychological state characterized by a profound, often unconscious, resistance to the maturation process and the heavy adult responsibilities that inevitably accompany it. At the core of this psychological profile is not necessarily a malicious intent to exploit or manipulate others, but rather a deeply ingrained emotional paralysis rooted in the fear of failure, the terror of mortality, and the overwhelming, suffocating weight of accountability. From a Jungian perspective, the Puer Aeternus lives what is termed the provisional life, a transient state of being wherein the individual perceives their current existence as merely a temporary, unimportant precursor to their real life, which is perpetually delayed, pushed endlessly into a vaguely imagined, idealized future. This potent delusion allows the man-child to avoid committing to a definitive career, a stable, long-term relationship, or a concrete personal identity, because to make a definitive choice is to mourn the loss of all other limitless, untested potentials of youth. Consequently, they remain suspended in an endless, agonizing adolescence, terrified that stepping into the structured adult world will extinguish their perceived specialness, their creative spark, or their spontaneous freedom. This developmental arrest is frequently compounded, and often initiated, by early attachment dynamics and family systems, where overprotective, helicoptering, or deeply enmeshed parenting styles may have shielded the boy from experiencing the natural, painful consequences of his own actions. By constantly intervening, these well-meaning caregivers inadvertently stunt the development of crucial executive functioning skills, frustration tolerance, and the emotional resilience required to navigate a world that will not cater to their every whim. When a child is never allowed to fail, to struggle with disappointment, or to self-soothe through a crisis, they do not develop the internal psychological scaffolding necessary to handle the inevitable adversities, rejections, and complexities of adulthood, leading them to subconsciously seek out surrogate parents in their adult relationships. In romantic partnerships, this dynamic manifests insidiously and destructively. The man-child will unconsciously outsource his emotional labor, his daily administrative life tasks, and his overarching executive functioning to his partner, slowly and predictably transforming the romantic dynamic from one of equal, interdependent adulthood into a heavily skewed caregiver-dependent relationship that inevitably breeds deep, corrosive resentment. The partner, who was perhaps initially drawn to his boyish charm, his infectious creativity, and his playful spontaneity, which are the undeniably positive, captivating traits often associated with the pure, soon finds herself completely exhausted by the relentless burden of constant emotional and logistical management. She essentially becomes the nagging mother figure that the man-child simultaneously relies upon for basic survival and violently rebels against to assert his pseudo-independence. This rebellion often takes the form of passive-aggressive defiance, weaponized incompetence, chronic procrastination, or retreating into highly stimulating escapist behaviors such as excessive video gaming, chronic substance use, or obsessive, time-consuming hobbies. These digital and recreational landscapes serve as impregnable psychological fortresses, offering a predictable, controllable environment where he can feel competent, powerful, and successful, perfectly protecting his fragile ego from the chaotic demands and potential humiliations of the real world. The psychology of the man-child is profoundly marked by a lingering, deeply rooted egocentrism and a relentless demand for instant gratification, strongly reminiscent of early developmental stages where the child genuinely believes the entire world revolves around their immediate physiological and emotional needs. When faced with valid criticism, interpersonal conflict, or the necessity of painful compromise, he frequently and predictably resorts to primitive psychological defense mechanisms like projection, denial, rationalization, and regression. He will readily deflect blame onto external circumstances, his boss, society, or his partner, effectively playing the perpetual victim rather than engaging in the agonizingly painful process of honest self-reflection and taking ownership of his shortcomings. Furthermore, the modern socioeconomic and cultural landscape provides an incredibly fertile petri dish that enables, normalizes, and even celebrates this extended adolescence. We live in an era characterized by prolonged educational periods, crippling economic instability, the disruption of traditional, tangible milestones of adulthood, such as early homeownership or stable, lifelong, pension-backed careers, and a glaring absence of meaningful cultural rites of passage that historically demarcated the clear transition from boyhood to manhood. This environment allows the man-child to comfortably rationalize his lack of progression and his emotional stagnation as a systemic, societal failing rather than a profound personal psychological deficit. Yet, beneath the carefully constructed veneer of carefree avoidance, the sarcastic detachment, and the stubborn refusal to grow up, there usually lies a profound, unacknowledged sorrow and a pervasive, gnawing sense of inadequacy. The man-child often secretly suffers from crippling low self-esteem and acute cognitive dissonance. He is usually highly intelligent and secretly acutely aware that he is falling further and further behind his peers, but he feels completely unequipped with the psychological tools necessary to bridge the rapidly widening gap between his chronological biological age and his stunted emotional maturity. His fierce resistance to commitment, whether to a demanding job, a loving partner, or a rigid set of moral values, is essentially a desperate defense mechanism guarding against the terrifying vulnerability of investing his whole self into something that might ultimately fail, thereby irrevocably breaking his comforting illusion of limitless, untapped potential. To heal from this syndrome and transition into genuine, grounded adulthood, the man-child must undertake the terrifying, heroic psychological journey of integrating his shadow. He must bravely confront the stark, undeniable reality of his own mortality, accepting the terrifying truth that time is finite, that doors are closing, and that potential without action is entirely meaningless. He must actively grieve the necessary loss of his eternal youth and completely abandon the comforting childhood fantasy that a magical savior, be it a parent, a partner, or a sudden stroke of luck, will always be there to rescue him from the consequences of his own choices and inactions. This profound psychological metamorphosis requires a radical, courageous acceptance of responsibility, not seeing it as a burdensome, soul-crushing trap that extinguishes personal freedom, but recognizing it as the very vehicle through which true autonomy, deep meaning, and genuine self-actualization are ultimately achieved. By slowly, deliberately taking ownership of his life, making small, binding, uncomfortable commitments, learning to sit quietly with the physical discomfort of negative emotions without immediately seeking a digital or chemical escape, and developing a profound, empathetic recognition of the impact of his daily behavior on those around him, the eternal boy can eventually cross the difficult threshold into authentic manhood, transforming his ungrounded, floating potential into a solid, actualized reality, and finally stepping out of the safe, familiar nursery and into the demanding, incredibly complex, yet deeply rewarding, vibrant arena of fully realized adult life.